everybody. This is Rob Keynes, your host of the Freedom Report. It is January 8th, 2025 on a Wednesday. This is going to be our end of 2024 year-end review and a sneak peek at what we may see in 2025. I'm just going to riff here for about 20 or so minutes, 25 minutes, and tell you what I think is going to happen and kind of recap what happened last year. So we'll start with a prediction I made in about third quarter 2023 that I thought 2024 would be a year of volatility. It certainly was in a lot of ways. The stock market kept going up, so did gold, did very well. Even though it faded there a bit at the end, it was up the most since 2010. A lot of the capital markets seemed to be turning over, rolling over in terms of what people were investing their money in. There was a lot of, you saw the politics happen during the presidential election. You saw the weakness in some of the markets during the summer. You saw a lot of geopolitical news occur. You saw a lot of things occur, the draining of the repo market, things like that, which made people think that we may not be on such stable ground. And we started to hear that even in the financial press, talking about the role of gold going forward and where we would be with regards to the financial markets. So I think that everybody sort of realized that the financial markets aren't near as healthy as maybe they've been in previous years. And I'm not talking about the debt burden and things like that. I'm just talking about the daily market and whether it's safe to be in this market even for a short time frame, 2, 3, 4, 5 months. And so we saw the weakness of the consumer really start to come out in 2024. The last part of 2024, we saw the ramp up in inflation. That's official inflation. When you look at the real inflation, things you actually buy, or if you look at shadow stats, we saw the rise of inflation substantially last year. So we're going into wave 2 of that 3-wave inflation model where we think is going to happen before you eventually have, the big financial issues. So that's kind of what we saw in 2024. And I want to give you a preview of 2025. So as I'm sitting here now, just having recorded an episode for Kinesis, which will be on the channel probably this week or next week, we did a part 2 of our annual series with Craig from TF Metals, Andy Scheckman from Miles Franklin, and Andy from Kinesis and Live from the Vault. We were kind of doing our part 2 of what we expect to see this year. So some of my thoughts on that were, as I've recently been traveling around, I've been to Europe and Spain and the UK, and then I did a second trip recently to UAE, where I went to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and then I also went to Turkey and Istanbul. We were doing a lot of research, economic research, and some filming of some content I hope to have on the channel later. And looking at the concept of sound money and economics and finance and talking to various people, industry experts, which we went to conferences, people that run local markets, people that have been involved in crashes before, people that are running companies offering sound money solutions, local traders, things like that, just to get a feel of what's going on. And really, I came back from those 2 trips with this foreboding sense of people are unsure about what's going on. Certainly, as we look at economics, and I talk about this all the time, we've got some issues with the capital markets. For example, it's reported today by the 𝙎𝙐𝙋𝙋𝙊𝙍𝙍 letter on Twitter that the 10-year yield note is nearing 4.7% Treasury, on their way to 8+% on their chart. And since the Fed pivot began 111 days ago, interest rates are up more than 110 basis points. Also reported on Bloomberg today that the 20-year hit 5%. Now, it hit 5% last year. In 2023, about a year and about 3 or 4 months ago. But the last time it really hit there and stayed above it was 2007, right before the financial crisis. So what we see is we've hit an indicator twice in the last year-ish that the last time we saw was before the Great Recession. And usually when it hits that level twice, it was last pierced that magic 5%. Well, we've been saying where if the Treasury markets stay there, we're in serious trouble. It's hit it twice, indicating that there is risk in the Treasury market. The view of the Treasury is the Treasury are not strong anymore. And if it pops above that line a third time, then we're in trouble, because that means it's going to be a breakout, technically speaking, and we'll be way above 5%. And we're over $1 trillion in debt service every year for the existing debt. If Treasuries go above 5%, that's going to skyrocket that number, because as we refinance old Treasuries out with new, and we've got something like $7 trillion, I think, that needs to be refinanced in 2025. If you're at higher interest rates, that raises debt service. When it raises debt service, you have less money available in the budget for all the things that you need. It starts to cause problems. Another issue that we had was when Yellen essentially issued a bunch of short-term debt. that short-term debt drained the reverse repo market and killed a bunch of the overnight liquidity in that market, and it put money into risk assets. So it's bidding up risk assets. If the new Treasury Secretary comes in and issues longer dated securities, that's going to cause people to go buy bonds and take money out of other markets, and it could cause a crash. So not only could we have a short-term liquidity crash in the repo market, we could have a longer-term issue with stocks and other risk assets based upon the way the Treasury has been acting and their expected actions for 2025 in dealing with this debt issue. In other words, to sum that up, we're at the point in which the debt has, the size of the debt and the interest payments on that debt has started to cause some major problems, and it's causing the U.S. government to jump through a bunch of hoops. Now, the rest of the world knows this. So what's happening is the rest of the world's developing a BRICS gold market, and it's going to rely on those other gold markets, your Russia market, your Dubai market, your Indian market, and your Chinese market, and they're going to build their own exchange. And what we saw last year was the price of silver go substantially higher in China in the Shanghai market than it did in the COMEX. I think it was like $3 an ounce higher. And what it did was in December, as I showed a couple of weeks ago when I last reported on China, the amount of trading in Chinese Shanghai market has increased in silver. And China being a market that's typically heavier physically delivered, the percentage of contracts physically delivered actually went down by the amount of the gross. In other words, there was more trading, but it wasn't in physical, it was speculative. Well, who's doing the speculative trading? What that's doing is it's edifying that Chinese market. It's showing that the world is coming in and using that Chinese market for pricing because they see the higher prices and people believe those higher prices. And eventually what could happen is if the Chinese market, and eventually because it's a part of the BRICS regional market, starts to separate more from the COMEX, a lot of traders may go over to that market seeing more credibility and seeing the prices that they're looking for. And it could cause a break in the control that the Western markets have, the LBMA and the COMEX specifically, on the gold and silver trade. Not only that, but that could extend to other commodities because a lot of banks and other intermediaries play in more than one market. So if you start to see separation of prices east, then you're going to see a separation of trade and more trade's going to go over there, and that's going to lessen the amount of influence that the Western markets have over that. And at the same time that everybody's de-dollarizing, dumping the dollar. So what you can see is people are slowly and steadily exiting the Western markets, the treasury market, the dollar market, which we talked about with de-dollarization, and now the commodities markets. And they're starting to pull over to the BRICS markets or other alternative markets. And remember, the first time in November, we saw the SWIFT report for the first time and since was on that report, like all time on that report, the US dollar fell to below 50% of monthly transactions. So what's happening is people are deleveraging out of the dollar and using other currencies. And because they're doing that, the other currencies are going to start to fill up those world reserves, and the dollar is going to fall eventually below 50% of world reserve currency, or I'm sorry, foreign held currencies, euro dollars, if you will, which essentially means the dollar no longer dominates international trade. It could still hold a stronger position than any other single currency, but overall, the other currencies of the world would have a stronger position than the dollar. And as you're building out those commodities markets, those trade markets, you're setting up gold-based systems in other countries, gold-based trade systems, other wire systems, other electronic currency systems, trade routes, things like that. You're seeing that the dollar has lost its influence in terms of international trade. And when it does, we have a big problem because that debt that I was talking about, if people aren't buying our debt and using our dollars, then interest rates will skyrocket on the bonds. And when the interest rate skyrockets on the bonds, our ability to pay off that interest rate debt on those bonds with current dollars is going to fall. And we're either going to have to make choices. We either go to austerity and deflation and cause the bonds to be worth less, basically, or essentially a default, a soft and then a hard default in the bond market. Or what will eventually happen is probably what they're going to do is they're going to hyperinflate. They're going to print more currency and eventually hyperinflate. And the more that they print the currency, the less the world's going to want it because they have these alternatives that have been set up, and that'll eventually lead to the crash of the dollar and the introduction of the central bank digital currencies. Now, that was a big long technical explanation for the fact that the dollar is dying, the central bank digital currencies are coming about. Now, there was an agreement around the world to use central bank digital currencies and basically turn up that system but the different regional powers looked at it and said, well, how is this going to benefit us? So CBDCs are coming. It's more become a political issue now than a technical one. The CBDCs are in place technically. They work. They've tested them. Now it's a matter of the political, all the various political entities agreeing on how that system is going to work. In other words, how they're going to divvy up that currency market and how it's actually going to work, all the details about how they're actually going to work. But CBDCs are right around the corner. So with those CBDCs right around the corner, the crash of the dollar right around the corner, we look at what's going to happen next. And does it officially start in 2025? I think it's already started. I mean, the last few years, we've seen the de-dollarization. The last 10 to 15 years, you've seen the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS coming together and the alternative trade and things like that. Certainly for over 20 years, both Russia and China have been accumulating gold like mad, and they've been doing it, off the books. Saudi Arabia recently got caught importing gold and they didn't report it. The PLA, the Liberation Army in China, is now buying gold so they don't have to report it because only a central bank does. And they're buying doré, as Craig mentioned on the Kinesis video. You'll probably see next week our video. What's happening is the Chinese are going straight to the miners and buying less than 99%. So they don't have to report it because it's less than 99% per some of the exchange rules, and they're not running through the exchange. They can refine their own. So they're buying doré bars at 95%, refining them and using that. So a ton of pool of current world production of gold and silver is going to some of these alternate economies outside the U.S. And certainly they're building up their stocks for their industry, but they're also building it for to base their monetary system or to back their monetary system, to give the world confidence. And this is continuing to build up these alternative currencies at a time that confidence in the dollar is falling, our interest rates are rising on bond debt, our ability to pay that off is cratering. We're $37 trillion in debt, more than in history, past the point of no return, according to research for any major country that's ever existed, and these statistics have been kept. So you can see where this is going. It's like the crash of the political system. Now, going back to my trips overseas, those 2 trips I made, when I'm talking to people, they see this and they see the fear of what's going to happen. What happens when this current economic system collapses? And a lot of this, what I'll call the dollar hegemony or the dollar dominance in the world, which has caused an export of inflation and wrecked worldwide economies, Argentina, Turkey, Zimbabwe, many others, and caused inflation in many other economies. They're starting to de-dollarize and come off the dollar, but they're crashing. And so you see these regional wars. You see it in the Middle East. You see it, certainly in Eastern Europe. And because I made trips to those 2 continents recently and talking with people, business leaders, people in local politics, influential people, and just talking to people at conferences and things like that, people that run the shows and do the media, talking to media types and financial media, just tons of people, you can see this fear starting to develop beyond the economics. What's going to happen politically, geopolitically? What's going to happen culturally? There's been a lot of cultural rot in a lot of countries where people feel as though their countries have been pulled away from what they knew as their identity, as you've had this migration, and then you've had the wars, and then you've had the economic issues. They're all coming home to roost at the same time. So there's a lot of fear. And a lot of the insiders that I know, or insiders and or wealthy people well connected, and that circle around, the insiders, certainly the ones that are in the know, are saying, what do I do? And one of the things I pointed out in Capital Cosm is the expat industry, or the leaving your home country industry, especially from the U.S. to other places for greener pastures, has recently exploded. I've had more conversations over the last 3 to 4 years over these companies that are offering these packages to Americans or to Europeans that want to get out of the Dodge and go somewhere else to plant a flag. Maybe they want to plant a financial flag and open a bank account in another country. Maybe they want to own property in another country. Maybe they want to establish residence and get a passport in another country. And now there's these packages. They've existed for a long time, but there are more of these, turnkey, I'm just going to give you a chunk of money and I can go live elsewhere and have it all done for me type of programs. And people have been wanting me to advertise those in my program. Now, I haven't really done that much, but you did see a couple of years ago, I did a couple of videos on that, talking about that, and it's exploded because people are looking at it saying, I don't know financially if I'm safe. I don't know physically if I'm safe. I don't know culturally I want to be here. And so people are leaving Western countries, Europe, Canada, and the dumpster fire that's become, and then also the United States. And turning to Canada here for a moment, the Trudeau issue, has he resigned? Is he not resigned? We see an announcement he's resigned. I saw another announcement in media, he hasn't resigned. He doesn't want to leave. Is it being forced out? Is he really wanting to leave? I don't know what that drama is. By the time this video comes out, it may have been solved, but there's drama going on right now with Canada's leadership and what's going on there. And you certainly see all the issues that they've had economically and culturally. Talk about the culture issues. It wasn't just the trucking issue and the banking issue. It's been the migration issue. It's been the economic policies. It's been the suppression of voices. All of those things have basically come home to roost. And I know some very wealthy people in Canada that are trying to get out of Dodge. They're trying to come to the U.S. or thinking about Mexico or one of these other places, so they can kind of stay on this side of the world, and maybe be close to family, but kind of get their residency out of Canada and plant that flag somewhere else. We're starting to see that more. And back to overseas, a lot of the people in Turkey, for example, looking at this going, do I want to be here? Because Turkey in the last, for so long have been a big ally of the Western powers in the U.S. And it seems to me, based on conversation I've had and what I've seen in the press and what I've read, and me being boots on the ground, just seeing things there and sort of getting the general feel for what people are talking about, the locals, it seems as though Turkey's turning east more towards the BRICS nations. And it's going that direction. Not only is it not an ally of the U.S., but it may be joining this faction of countries in the Middle East that are shifting power in that region. And certainly with all that shifting power in that region, you're going to see a lot of dynamics going on geopolitically, culturally, and certainly economically that are going to change a lot of things. Not only will that pull support from the US dollar, but it's also going to set up more of a regional conflict in that area that's going to cause trade issues. It's going to cause political issues. It's going to cause new alliances to form. And that certainly is going to put a big dent in what we consider the Western system overall. And you can certainly see it in Eastern Europe. I have a friend that's out there in the Eastern Europe Russian area. He's saying that the Russians have a lot of confidence. Putin's not going to back down. He's not afraid of NATO. The Russians are going to stand their ground. So if NATO and the US, and Ukraine keep pushing on Russia, keep attacking Russia with missiles and things like that, that's a powder keg waiting to blow up. And I'll go back to my experience in 2014 when I graduated from Norwich, and I sat in that. It was a military college, and I was one of the few civilians, I was in residency. I was going to these residency week classes they were putting on. We went to one where we had a European diplomat and some college people high up in the college and some other people on a panel talking about how we could have, big global, conflagration, or i.e. World War III or something similar, tick off. And it was Eastern Europe and the Middle East were the two that they were talked about. And they talked about this is probably inevitable, right? And now we're seeing that happen. And we're seeing Russia not want to back down. We're seeing Russia and NATO, to butt heads. Now news just came out today that Indonesia joined the BRICS, and Indonesia is the 5th largest country in the world, 270-ish million people, a long chain of islands of a bunch of different cultures, and now they're on the BRICS side. So you're starting to see the entire world, and I predicted this about 3 years ago. I said, I was on a Metal Monies and Mines virtual conference as a guest speaker, and I said, you're going to have commodity wars and geopolitical wars. And 3 or 4 years ago, I said this. We've definitely had the commodity wars, and now the geopolitical realignment is occurring, just like I predicted back then. How did I see that? How could I possibly make that call? Well, you just look at what happened. If you read enough data and you look at enough things around the world, you can see the writing on the wall. You could see the end of the dollar system coming. You could see people getting tired of the Western policies. You could see the disadvantages of dollar exporting inflation and how it wrecked economies and people wanting to get out of it. You could see how China and Russia were starting to build, and these other nations in BRICS, along with a lot of other outside, nations that were forming these alliances. And you could see it with the latest Middle Eastern conflict that the U.S. go in, that things shifted. You could see the rhetoric shift. You could see the sentiment shift from U.S. partners, and the U.S. just going full bore and doing what they're doing, and the U.K. and all. And you could just see it start to happen, that you could predict that. And that's exactly what's happening. A lot of this is economic. A lot of the basis is economic. A lot of it, however, is cultural and geopolitical, where people look at it and say, we're tired of these policies. They don't benefit us. We thought we were getting into an agreement. This is not the way we thought it was going to turn out. The economically and politically taken advantage of are now rebelling against the United States and the West. And this is going to bring great changes. And I think in preparation for this, it goes beyond gold and silver. Again, I have to do my disclaimer. I'm not your financial advisor. I'm not your legal advisor. Consult those, your legal and financial experts before you do anything. This is just for education, research, and entertainment purposes only, okay? That's my disclaimer. But looking at what I look at, it certainly seems that gold and silver are probably going to be the safest thing that you can own in terms of assets. And I'll just let you know, I'm not in anything but gold, silver, a bucket of cash, and food and that type of thing. I don't have a lot of other financial investments. I'm not in any stocks right now. I don't own any bonds. I sold my last cryptocurrency that I had just a speculation, not because I thought it was long-term sound money. I mean, some people think it is, and that's, if you do, that's fine. My that's all gone. I didn't have that much to begin with, and I'm just sitting on almost about zero. I'll be zero debt at the end of this month, and I'm just sitting on a pile of what I consider cash or very safe assets, low risk assets, because the risk that I see in the world, it's not worthwhile taking any risk at some point. Why would I want to own a bond? That's insane, especially anything over like a few months. I wouldn't want to have exposure to that. Even a few months now is risky because you can start to see the system rotting and falling apart. And I don't even know if I would own, 3 or 6 month or anything for 3 or 6 month, regardless of the date of the treasury or the T-bill or whatever the case may be. And I certainly don't want to own stocks. The corporates are the most leveraged in history, and the job situation has gotten worse. I just don't see the corporate sector doing well. Certain sectors may, like defense, but I'm out of all that. And why did I do that? Well, I did that because if I know risk is coming, and I was a former risk analyst for many years, auditor, risk analyst, cyber risk analyst, business risk analyst, that type of thing. I look at all the risk in the world, I'm like, I don't want to take that risk. Okay, that's economically. What's going beyond that, though, is the lawlessness and the lack of moral value in the political system. I'm going to give you a really graphic example. So if you have kids, you may want to pause or turn off the video now and put your kids in the other room before what I'm about to say. There was a case in the UK of a 12-year-old girl being captured and raped, and then she escaped, found a taxi cab and said, "Please get me out of here. I've been through hell." That was her quote, not my words, her quote. The taxi cab took her to another location. 4 Asian men gang raped her for 12 hours before she was finally found. And those guys were convicted recently, and they received less of a sentence, less than 20 years, for what they had done to that girl than somebody on social media had said for saying something that offended somebody. Not that it was illegal, not that it violated something specific, but the court found that it offended somebody. So you're seeing things that don't make sense in the government. You're seeing the governments make decisions that don't make sense, that morally could be very reprehensible, that don't edify culture. So again, it's gone beyond the economic. It's gone into the culture and the geopolitical and the military and all that kind of stuff. So you're seeing sort of the falling apart of the Western economies and the Western culture, and the rise of the East and the rise of the Slavic and the Russian, and the rise of the Middle Eastern. And you're just seeing it turn over that way, and that's sort of the era we're going through. And 2025 certainly is going to be a big catalyst. One of the things that I said this morning on the interview was, as you look at the repo market being drained, and you look at the consequences and when that happens, and you look at the fact that the next Treasury Secretary is going to push longer term issuance to force people into bonds, what's probably going to happen is you're going to see a crack in the banking system. It's going to crash. I expect in 2025 at least one bank to begin to crash because of liquidity issues, because of issues of not having enough deposits to support operations, because the debt has gotten too expensive, because they can't issue new debt to new people. The consumers are tapped out on debt. So they're going to be stuck with these high risk assets that are going to start to collapse. And the value of them is going to collapse. Because think about when bond rates rise. When bond rates rise, the face value comes down. The face value of that bond is inversely proportional to the interest rate. Why? Well, let's say you have a bond you issued at 3%, and so its face value is $1,000, right? And then the next bond comes out at 4%. It's paying a higher yield. Well, the face value of the bond that you have at 3% has to fall. You have to discount it because you're only given 3% for that bond. So maybe it comes down to $930. Well, that $70 off of that 1,000, or whatever the number would be, depending on the market, it could change depending on the market. If it comes off, then the value of that bond, that face value of that bond comes down. That means that the bank's assets, or the corporate assets, whoever's holding that bond, the individual's assets, have come down by that much. And you multiply that by trillions of dollars of debt, and all of a sudden you've just evaporated that much value in the corporates and in the banking system in terms of their held assets. And that's the danger of holding debt as an asset, because when interest rates rise, the value of debt falls, of existing debt falls, to compensate for the new debt that's coming out at higher interest rates. And what that does is it collapses balance sheets, and it makes banks and corporates insolvent, or even people insolvent, to where they don't have the assets to back up the liabilities that they have. And so technically they go into a default. What happens is the investors and or the depositors who are holding money there or have invested in that stock of that corporate or that bank panic and they run. And once they pull that money out, it's just a cascade and it collapses. That's what happened to, SVB and was it First Republic and Silvergate and all those guys a couple of springs ago. So that's what we think that we're going to see again this year, at some point in time this year, a collapse of the banking system because of everything that's going on. Now, what does that mean for you? How do you prepare for this? What do you do? Well, in terms of the financial risk, like I said, gold, silver, cash is what I'm doing. You should research and do what you think is best. Certainly make the decision that's best for you. Consult your advisors, your professional advisors. But you may also begin to think about other things. If we're going to have a collapsing economy, which would lead to rising unemployment, rising unrest, stresses on local, county, and state budgets, stresses on the police, the education system, all of these state-run agencies, that's going to lead to more unrest and potentially more rioting and chaos like we saw, back when you had the riots in the Northwest. Maybe that comes to a broader scale to America, the unrest, the unhappiness, the anger, the frustration. People depending on government that can't now maybe issue those extra food stamps or that extra financial assistance. For example, at church this weekend, this past Sunday, I was at church and they announced that this upcoming Saturday we're doing our food distribution. So I'll be there doing food distribution on Saturday for people that need it through the church. That food is distributed to the church or donated to the church by local companies who either buy it or who are in the food industry and give it. And those donations have been going down for the last several months. So we're not going to have as much money or as much food, for people that need food to make ends meet because maybe they don't have enough money to buy their own food. Maybe they're on food stamps or even beyond that. And they don't have to be homeless. There are a lot of people that have homes that just can't afford food right now. And so they're having to make the choice between paying their mortgage or buying food. And so they come to churches, and this one food bank that serves about 12 churches in my area says, we don't have that much food. We may have a third or 40% of what we typically had. And why are companies donating less? Because it's hitting their bottom line. They don't have the excess capital to donate money for this food. And food costs have gone up. So you've had food costs going up. You've had the available money for food banks going down. And that's a double whammy on the amount of food that can be stored and distributed. At the same time, that more and more consumers are living paycheck to paycheck, because we saw come out last week that statistic that the highest rate of people living paycheck to paycheck in a long, long time, I forgot the actual date, it's been decades, it's now 26%. In fact, it may be ever, 26% of people living paycheck to paycheck. I think that was ever since this statistic was kept. You got more than a quarter of the population that if they don't get that paycheck, they can starve. And even if they get the paycheck, with the rising prices, they're having to downgrade. That was on the Bank of America report, where people are having to downgrade to lesser quality stores and cheaper stores to be able to make ends meet. And then you have the auto market collapsing. You also has come out today that mortgage rates are at the highest they've been in a very long time. And so people aren't able to afford housing. So we're having a turnover in the housing market, prices starting to come down. So all of this is starting to collapse. And what's that going to do? It's going to lead to anger, unrest, where the government doesn't have the ability this time to just print more money and to just give, more stuff to the people. It just, if it does it this time, it's going to lead to hyperinflation or a collapse of the debt market, because we already talked about that, at the beginning of the video. So people aren't going to be able to turn to the government. So what do? So you have to look at it from, well, that means the prices of goods are probably going to skyrocket. So you're going to want to secure your water and your food and things like that. Think about long-term food, things like that. Think about your physical safety, things like that. Just saying, put it on your radar. If you have any extra money to look at those things, that may be something that you consider, okay? Consider the information, do your research, and decide what you want to do. Now, where does it lead geopolitically? If the United States has caused all this inflation over the years and its policies have not been beneficial to the rest of the world, and its rhetoric and all that, and the world gets tired of it, the U.S. may not be able to source things that are based on, say, rare earths, which China controls, or other goods and services that we need, and trade may become harder. And then also the U.S. may get in trouble for all the wars that it's in, and people are like, we've had enough of it, and they push back, and maybe, the U.S. starts getting attacked or something like that. Or, and by attacked, I can mean culturally in terms of rhetoric about the way that we live, politically in terms of how our leaders are viewed, kinetically in terms of actual hot wars and things like that, trade-wise in terms of what we can source and what our goods are worth. Do people buy our services anymore? Do we need to go back to manufacturing again? We're going to go through some huge changes here in the future. And so that's going to affect everybody, and it increases the overall level of risk in the system. And I think the risk is just going to continue to increase until the system breaks and has a reset. And we've been talking about that reset for the last few years, and that's what a reset looks like. It's not just a financial reset. And just having some gold and silver, in my opinion, is not going to save you. You have to think about water. You have to think about food. You have to think about the safety of where you live. You have to think about the viability of your governments. You have to understand the cultural changes that are going on. You have to think about your education, the education of your kids. You have to think about a lot of things. And that's really what we're going to start to see in 2025 is how does this change across the landscape of where we live and what's going on. So I really think that's where it started back during 2020, 2021. We know what happened with the health scare that we had. I'm going to use those terms, health scare, because of certain filters. We know after that health scare, what happened is now the culture and the political, the degradation that's actually been occurring for decades has been brought to the front. And now you're adding the economic on top of it. And now it's starting to break the norms and cultures and values of our society and really challenge what we believe. And in some cases, a lot of people are going back spiritual. They're going back to Christianity. They're going back to their churches and things like that. But it's also causing strife and things like that. So those are the types of things we're seeing. We're seeing that rotation from, sort of the glory days we had to a little bit of tougher times. And the concept of tougher times is get ready for those, and certainly be spiritually prepared, be physically prepared, be financially prepared, be aware of what's going on around you, pay attention to that. And just know that this will occur for a number of years. And this occurs during the nation state cycle. We've talked about this a number of times on my program, the research that Sir John Glubb did for 2,700 years of history, where at about 250-ish years in the dominant nation state, it starts to fall off, another one rises, you go through all these problems. Then you start to go back to the values that made you a great nation. Somewhere you reach some equilibrium point, but that nation state won't be dominant anymore. So in history, the history is the U.S. won't be dominant anymore in politics and culture and in thought leadership and in economics. So just be prepared for that. Meaning the subsequent generations beyond the ones now are going to have a little bit harder time. They have to go earn it a little bit more. Things will be a little bit tougher. It's going to require more frugality and stuff like, our ancestors, like dating back to the 40s and 50s and even before, had to go through. So we're going to have to rebuild a lot of things culturally, socioeconomically, economically, politically, and things like that. So we're going to go through a long period of social change as well as economic change and cultural change, and that's what I see coming. I do, again, there's a lot of fear, but I'm not trying to scare people. If you understand, if you've prayed and been spiritually connected to God, then certainly you understand, the path of this taking, and not to worry, to give it away to God. I'll leave it at that. But if you're in a state of worry for whatever reason, just know that there are things that you can do to prepare for this, and most of it is spiritually and mental. The spiritual and the mental needs to occur first before you do anything else. Don't go spend a bunch of money on stuff and do all this other preps until you've got that down, until you've got your head on straight, your heart on straight, if you will, and then begin to think about the things that you want to do. And certainly if you've made preparations, you may want to go back and re-examine those and say, have I prepared in the right areas? Have I done the right things? Am I doing the right things? Because, politically and the well-connected and a lot of the merchant class and business class is starting to really worry. And this is what I'm getting from conferences and interviews and the travel that I've had is there's a lot of underlying fear and worry. And certainly when those people begin to worry, then we've got issues, because they're the ones that have the money, that run society, that have the political influence, that are the politicians, that run the companies and run the infrastructure. And when those guys start to worry, it's probably time for you to start to look at the situation, start to draw some conclusions about what you need to do, really. Sum up economically, I fully expect bank failures to occur this year. I fully expect us to have additional unrest. I fully expect us to have some corporates fail. I expect us to have some job loss. I expect us to see bad news about what's going on around the world as we go through additional conflict. I expect to see strife in the political cycle, regardless of who's president or governor or school board. You're going to see more strife in that. You're going to see more people struggling to make ends meet. A lot of it's going to be how much you love your neighbor, how much you can take care of your neighbor. A lot of our cohesiveness as a nation is going to center around our cohesiveness as people, our spiritual beliefs, and how we're going to help each other. And we're going to learn as Americans again to survive together. We're going to survive together. No longer can you live in a neighborhood or an apartment or in a building where you don't know anybody around you. Not only will you know everybody around you, you're going to be borrowing and trading sugar for milk and that type of thing. You better start to get to know the people around you, because you're not going to have a choice. Local markets are going to come back. Farmers markets are going to come back. People are going to grow victory gardens. People are going to keep things they would have thrown away before and say, hey, can I use this? Can I trade it? That kind of stuff's going to happen. And the interview that I did when I was in Spain, when I was in Europe, I will say I interviewed Fernando, who used to live in Argentina. He now lives in Europe. He travels around a bit. So I caught up with him on one of his travels, and we did an interview. And in that interview, we went back to that 2000 peso crisis, and he kept saying, when you go through that, anything that you have could be of value. Barter comes back. Certainly, if you have the dollar, if the dollar's not there, if you have another currency that people value economically. But he said, from a neighborhood standpoint, there may be a little bit of distrust of people around you because you don't know, who's desperate. But you got to try to make friends, and the closer, tighter network you have with your family and trusted ones, the easier it's going to be able to survive. It's your network that really matters. And so, all of those practical things that our parents and grandparents went through during the Great Depression are all going to come back. Whether or not this manifests in depression, I've always said I think it'll be worse than the last one, but it'll be sharp and brutal, but people prepared will survive, and then we'll begin to rebuild. And I think that's what's going to happen. But I think the tough times are here, and I think economically and politically we can definitely see that. So it's that preparation, around that process. And certainly, physical security is something that you need to consider around your house and your person. Definitely, I've been taking, some self-defense, martial art type stuff, and all that kind of. I'll leave that for, other channels to talk about. Go to your prepper channels and go to your gun channels and martial arts channels for all that kind of stuff. But that's something you may also want to consider, and I think that's coming forward. But just purely economically, going back to wrap up, economically very tough times leading to other things that you want to think about, secondary and tertiary consequences. Think about all that stuff and start to prepare for that. And that's really my preview of 2025. I think it started already, but it's going to go to another level. It's going to go up a notch, and you're going to begin to see a lot of that stuff occur. So if you only prepared economically, there's other things that you may want to think about. And if you haven't prepared at all, you may want to pray real hard about that today as soon as you see this video, and ask God what you should be doing, and then go do what he directs you to do. And also talk to some people about just general preparedness for all of these types of things, and think about what they do and what you could do, and develop a plan. It's kind of like you see the wildfires going on out in California right now and all the houses burning. There is a plan that you can have for when something like that happens. You establish a plan, you practice it with your family, and you implement. Well, that's what I'm telling you need to do, because the wildfires around the world are burning, and they're coming to the U.S. to burn as well. We're not going to be exempt from it. And so develop your plan to protect yourself, your family, and your friends, and begin practicing that plan. It's just common sense. It's just what you need to do. And it's cyclical. It happens every 250 years. It's just the way it is. You take 3 80-year conjunctive cycles or economic cycles equals a nation state cycle equals a preparedness cycle. And that's what we're going through. So take all of that research, consider it, do what you need to do, protect yourself and your family. And just know that while we're all blessed to have what we have in this world, just know that preparedness is a part of living, and being cognizant of what's going around you as a part of living in this world, in this material world. Now, when we come back on the program next time and go heavy into economic, I've got a lot of exhibits and a lot of things to talk about. It's going to be a power pack. And when I say power packed, I mean, this might be one of the most dense power packed episodes I do in a very long time. I've got a ton of data and a ton of conclusions. I may have to break it in 2 parts, but stay tuned to the next one. If you guys like the data side of what I do, I'm going to hit it real hard this time and show you a bunch of stuff. And this is going to be key to how financially, economically you survive 2025. And I say survive because you got to survive first before you thrive. And this is going to be a survival year. That's going to be the theme of 2025. Last year was volatility. I said 2024, volatility in all things, not just economically. 2025 is about survival. of the consequences of the volatility we've seen the last few years, and even dating back to the last 80 years in that economic cycle, but particularly the last few years. Now we're shifting from just volatility to major issues in survival and eventually getting past that and into the next, period of growth that eventually we will get to, but it's going to take a while. So yeah, there's a lot more that I want to say, but I'll save it for the next episode. We'll have a lot of data exhibits, and we'll continue to talk about that. And I think for 2025, I'm really going to spend a lot of time focusing on preparation and getting people to see that you need to prepare in many different ways. And we're going to take that step on the Freedom Channel. We're going to talk more culturally and geopolitically like we have been. We're going to talk about preparation, like real preps. We're going to talk a little bit about some spiritual prep and things like that. We're going to mix it all in. This is what the Freedom Report was destined to be when we made those changes last summer, and that's what we're turning into. And because it goes way beyond just the gold and the silver, and I think you guys know that if you've been watching me for any length of time. I'm going to wrap it up. We're at 40 minutes. God bless everybody. See you next time. This is Rob, your host with the Freedom Report.